Hello everyone, my name's Stephen Redman and welcome to Pastor's Library. This is the channel where we talk about everything to do with theology books that might be on a reading list for your seminary course, for your bachelor's or master's degree in theology or in biblical studies, or perhaps just books that you've seen on a bookshelf in a shop or indeed in your own pastor's library. So today I want us to talk about a particular book which is looking like it's going to be one of this year's big sellers, and I'm filming this in March, so there's a lot of the year yet to come. And this is a book by Nijay Gupta, and it's called Strange Religion. The theory behind this book is that Christians in the first century were thought of as being weird, dangerous, and yet compelling. And I think what Gupta is trying to get us to understand is that our understanding of religion today is totally different to the first century understanding of religion. And what the Romans thought of those first Christians was a very, very different thing indeed to what we might imagine. And Gupta is trying to give us context that will help us in our reading of our New Testament, helping us to see exactly what the early church was within the context of the communities in which it existed in the cities and the towns of the Roman Empire. So he introduces himself as being a resident of Portland, Oregon, which he says, this is not my saying, is the weird capital of the USA. It gives a few examples of why it's weird. And whereas he says he stops short of being a conspiracy theorist, he has experienced a lot of weird in his life. But he starts with talking about how weird Christians were in the first century. He talks a lot about the Pax Deorum, which was peace with the gods, that the Romans believed in, and even believed is probably not quite the right word, but the Romans lived in a society which was driven by activity that would help maintain peace with the gods. They accommodated new gods, they accommodated foreign gods, they had a lot of space as long as there was an appropriate ritual involved. And they struggled with believers because they didn't quite get the belief thing, the faith thing. They sort of thought that if you were ritual in your behaviour towards worshipping gods, that if you didn't put a foot wrong, if you did it all right, then everything would go well with you. And this is why, of course, sometimes Christians got the blame when things went wrong in regions and cities, because they weren't worshipping according to accepted rituals. There was a pecking order for gods, and having a god who had been crucified was an anathema. It was a terrible thing for anyone to venerate a criminal, and worshipping without statues was absolutely crazy. How could someone worship without a statue? So having traditions and rituals were okay, but having beliefs, no, that wasn't really it. He talks about superstitio, which I think is Latin for superstitions, and he talks about how the difference between the behaviour of Christians in their worship compared with Romans worshipping Jupiter or whoever else. He brings into comparison innovation and the ancientness of religion, ecstatic behaviour compared with ritual behaviour, and the unindividualised versus the corporate. and the desperate compared with the effective. And these sort of 4 comparisons, there's a whole chapter on that, and he discusses how this was the difference between the Christian and the standard religious person. He actually talks about Christians in your area lowering property values, which I think is a great sense of how we can understand how we might have felt. But I think it's quite realistic what he's saying, that people who were worshipping locally this Jesus would bring your locality into disrepute. It may be that he has a great deal of respect for other learned people, but he quotes Mary Beard a lot, the Roman historian. There is a whole section on time, and he talks about the Romans had a focus on festivals as being their worship time, whereas we had a focus on the first day of the week being a regular worship time. If you actually look at the number of festivals that would happen in a city over a year, it wasn't much more than the number of Sundays in a year, but they were not particularly on any given day of the week. But it's an interesting comparison, and for them, for you to not engage in festivals seemed irreligious, it seemed strange. Time for Christians was about incarnation, about the life, death, resurrection and ascension of Jesus, and very essentially it was about his imminent return. And his discussion about time in this book is without question a good read. He talks about house churches and the importance of a shared meal. He talks about the concept of family as being very different. And he talks about a Roman writer who suggests that Christians go into houses and have raucous incest with each other, using the admittance that Christians greeted each other with a holy kiss. And it shows how the idea of what a Christian was very, very different to the reality. Jesus closed the gap between man and God because all of a sudden there are no priests. In fact, the church is a group of priests called from every nation and every class of society. And the priesthood was something which set you apart on the highest levels of the social pecking order. But for Christians, there were no priests other than we all were priests. And it's very, very good reading. So, for example, he talks about the language of fruitfulness being totally alien to those who just worshipped the idols of the day, and imitating Christ as being something that would seem unimportant and ludicrous to the Roman population. Imitating someone who was executed for crimes against the Roman Empire would seem to be very stupid. And the characteristics he represented, those of humility and love and righteousness and purity, were really not those characteristics that were favoured in Roman society. Basically, he summarises that the early church were obsessed with Jesus, were focused on the future, and they were a religion of heart and a religion that focused on God with us. And I have to say, this is an incredibly accessible book. You'll see it's got a bit of a curve on it. I tried desperately hard not to bend my paperbacks, but I have with this one. It's a really, really easy to read book. It is academic. It has a few pages of end notes, doesn't have any footnotes, but it's eminently quotable. It's written by somebody who is gifted in communication, who can keep you so focused on the story that you don't want to close the book. I have spread this into reading over 2 days, but it was very difficult to break off. I tell you, this is a really excellent book. You might remember last year I told you about Tell Her Story, which is without doubt one of the best-selling Christian books of 2023, and that's a Gupta classic. And I think that Strange Religion might be almost as big in this coming year as Tell Her Story was in the last. Gupta has written some great commentaries. He has collaborated with others on the IVP Dictionary of Paul and his Letters, for example. And there are some very serious books, some of them quite technical, some of them not so technical, but all of them are accessible. And I have to say, Nijay Gupta, in my mind, is an extremely good author, someone that you just simply want to read. Just a few other simple books he's written, which are worth a look. The New Testament Commentary Guide. Of course, someone who writes a guide to New Testament commentaries, it's immediately out of date, but it's still a very good book. That was written in 2020, so it's still got some life in it. 15 New Testament Words of Life. I love books that have numbers in the title, and that's a great one. And A Beginner's Guide to New Testament Studies by Nijay Gupta. That is a brilliant entry point if you're going to go and do a degree or something. It's a good one to read in the holidays before you start your course, that type of a book. But loads of books out there that he's written, and he's got other ones coming out in the next year. He's about to launch the first in the new series of Word Biblical Commentary Themes, and that's on Galatians, so look for that. But seriously, if you are remotely interested in the first century church, in understanding where we come from as an organisation, then reading Strange Religion would be a great thing for you to start the year off with. I hope that's helped you. If it has, please leave a comment below. Please click on the thumbs up and make sure you've subscribed, please. And click on the bell, and then you'll know when we release another episode of Pastor's Library. Until the next time, everyone, bye!